Data from the National Bureau of Statistics shows China's annual consumer inflation rate accelerated to 2.1% in July, exceeding expectations. Non-food prices, particularly those closely related to the service sector, saw a noticeable jump, reflecting people's growing appetite for service consumption. However, a growing concern about credit card debt is rising at the same time. According to the People's Bank of China, outstanding RMB loans in China grew 12.7% in June 2018 from a year earlier. Loan growth in China averaged over 16% from 1998 to 2018, and the country's outstanding household consumer loans surged nearly 30% last year. Why does a rapid loan growth result in much lower repayment? And how will the banks and government cope with this? In China, a cashless trend is taking hold with mobile payments led by WeChat and Alipay, totaling roughly $5.5 trillion last year, 50 times greater than in the United States. Once people link their smartphones to credit cards, the money transfers easily in an invisible way. Is this one reason why Chinese youth are being saddled with increasingly cumbersome levels of debt? Traditionally, Chinese people have preferred not to use credit cards because they didn't want to owe anyone money. Is the Chinese culture losing its long-standing frugality? Or are people turning to credit cards because of low salaries?
Millennials and credit cards for China is a pejorative and concerning coupling. As credit card usage continues to rise, the Chinese youth are being saddled with increasingly cumbersome levels of debt. But need they be concerned? Is this a normal phenomenon or linked to the housing? Or perhaps is Chinese culture shedding its former and long-standing culture of frugality? To talk about these and issues more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Andy Mok, who is the Managing Director of the Red Pagoda Resources, and Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics, and Flora Liu, the founder of Joyview Education. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yuan. So we are talking about the credit loans, the credit card loans by some young people, especially millennials. How big a problem is that? Are young people living beyond their means? Professor Liu?
Well, first of all, let's question whether it is a problem. Because, kids, whether Chinese culture is still breeding the notion that the kids should really live on their parents, particularly when they are in schools, and even after their school. For example, every year we turn out like 7 million graduates from the college. Actually, roughly 1 million won't really be able to get a job. It's not that their job is not available, but they are being selective, they are more reliant on the family support. So actually this is the period that they overdraw more from their credit card.
So it is understandable, you're saying?
Yeah, I think now we are now in a very, we are now in in a very interesting transition period where the traditional culture, the parents should really look after their children for a longer period of time, and also now the children themselves, they wanted to be more individualistic, but they are less independent. So it's just really
you mean financially?
That's right.
Independent.
Yeah.
And Flora, you've been involved with a lot of young students in their early 20s. How do you look at their lifestyle, and how do they manage their finances?
First of all, I am a millennial myself. I'm pretty young, but I must be an atypical millennial because I'm not depending on my parents anymore, and I'm generating.
Do you have debt in the first place?
No, I don't. I paid it all off after 2 years of work experience, and now I'm generating cash flow for my company and for my employees. But day to day, I interact with a lot of parents and students, especially the teenagers, and I can see that 90% of the time is devoted to education or any sorts of training, and the biggest cost of the family, I would say, is educational cost, and that is deemed as an investment instead of a cost.
So we're talking about those who already, through education, already are coming to the career life.
Yeah, I interviewed 2 of my interns last night and asked about whether they use credit card or not.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, they use credit card, but it's a special sort of credit card connected to Alipay. It's called Huabei. The interest
But do they
rate,
overspend? I mean,
yes,
do they
yes,
own
they
debt?
do. Yes, they do. But the amount is not too high. Usually, they would use Huabei to fill the gap before their salary is received every month.
So these are the disciplined spenders. They pay
disciplined spenders. Yes.
But are they the rule or exception? My question.
There are exceptions. One of my interns told me that one of her schoolmates dropped out of the school because she was in debt, and she spent a lot of money and she had no ability to pay off the debt, and she received threats from the loan sharks.
Where did she loan the money from?
One of the P2P, one of the 校园贷, the campus loan. Yeah.
I think this is an increasingly bigger problem for China. The young students, young people, they spend a lot of money, but that's not the problem only. They spend the money on the borrowed money from P2P platforms or even loan sharks. And is that a problem?
Well, of course it is a problem if you borrow money from the wrong people. But I think if we step back and take a look here, that first of all, the China of today is not the same country as the China 50 years ago, meaning that 50 years ago, China was still a country of scarcity. So people had to work to survive. And I think now people like Flora and people younger than her grew up really in an economy of abundance. So I think that's a natural development that people first, independent adulthood gets delayed, whether that's marriage, whether that's financial independence, because it is a kind of a modern world luxury that you don't have to work to pay your rent or put food on the table, but you can take the time to discover what you want. So I think that's the first point. The second point then is, how do you finance this stage of your life, right? Now, I think it's a regulatory problem. It's also, I think, a market development problem. Because just when you look like in the United States during the gold rush, you go out to North Dakota, South Dakota, there are no rules. So anyone that had money and wanted to lend it to you could. Of course, they had little recourse other than violence to collect. But similarly, if you were a debtor, you were also at risk. So I think this is really the story of China, in that this explosive economic growth creates new industries, and it takes time for norms and regulatory practices to catch up. And I think this is maybe where we are with consumer finance.
Talking about the regulator's job, what went wrong in terms of regulations? Why these P2P lenders have seen such a sudden boom all of a sudden?
Well, for the Chinese regulation, it's always lagging behind because the legislators, government officials, they also have a longer learning curve than the development of the reality. So, like dealing with e-commerce, dealing with counterfeits, and everything else. So until it becomes a big social problem, they won't really pay very close attention to it. So legislation is lagging behind, and that's one part of the story. But another is that the financial market has gone to a very sophisticated stage where we need further study, we need more of the expert opinions to support the legislation process, and also the a third reason is that the enforcement is very scarce. For example, even the normal student loan from the government, the collection rate is still very low. Lastly, I think the lack of the credit rating system or credit reference system, or lack of enforcement of it, can really give people a chance to run away and break the entire credit system in this country in the financial market.
But did the regulators see this coming? There is a need for financing for young people to support their lifestyle. And there is a supply that is from investors who don't have other channels to put their money.
That's right.
Why didn't the regulators see this? There was a mismatch. And
well, maybe I can jump in for a second on this, because I think what Professor Liu said is completely true, and that China in many ways is still developing. But I think it's also a deliberate policy choice, where this is what accounts, I think, for a large part of the economic and entrepreneurial vitality in China.
But if something goes wrong, it can develop and it can escalate. For example, the problems with recent busting of some of the peer-to-peer platforms have created not only economic problems, and social problems for the government. Isn't that something we should be more careful about?
I think now politically there have been two major drivers in that. For the mass entrepreneurship, and so this is really there to help. It is really the good intention of the government to help better access and also enlarged access to those startups. But not all startups are doing well, and not all young people are really doing startups just to borrow money. And the other is to encourage domestic consumption as a shift from investment-driven or export-driven economy into consumption-driven, so liquidity becomes a major problem. And in addition to it, actually, another good intention of the government is to have to build more access to the Chinese farmers who are able to have this more credit so that they can really build a better crop year and raise more in of their say crops, etc. So despite all the political good intention, but legislation is not really following in synchronization.
I want to talk a little bit about the financial literacy of those young people. Did they realize there's a risks of borrowing money from a lender without collateral, and you don't have firm projection of your viability in the future? Your friend who borrowed from the P2P lender on campus, did she know there are risks?
I think she might have known that there were a risk, but if you look into the marketing language of the P2P lending companies, you will see that they downplay the risks. And they highlight the high return, or like zero interest rate and no collateral. But when you have to really loan money from them, you'll have to follow their instructions, and you'll find the deliberately hidden messages from the...
So you were saying they were swindled by those financial vehicle companies?
Yeah, both swindled by the financial companies and also because they are purchasing luxury goods. And when they really want something, they probably just choose to forget about the risks.
So is there a mechanism to ensure that both the lenders and the borrower should be not only well informed but well regulated in case these kind of things won't happen again or in large scale?
I think number one is the license system.
From the banking regulators.
Yeah, from the banking regulators, and also we can really, like the United States, they have the FCA, the Federal Credit Agency, who are particularly targeting those lending and also to the consumer credits. And in the meantime, right now actually the Chinese government is actively pushing forward with, for example, the capital requirement of those lending platforms and the credibility, etc. So another one is really insurance. So both the platform and the consumers should really buy insurance, so that insurance will serve as a guarantor to even out, even if it means a little more extra cost. It really can prevent a social turmoil after all the domino effect of those triangle debts. So, and also I think now education is also very important, particularly for students and for farmers. They just think, well, it's money, so in front of me, it's free. So this is something that is very, dangerous.
But I think all these things happen because they're under the radar of the regulators. These loan sharks or shadow banks or P2P lenders, they have not been have been watched by the regulators that closely. That's why the central government has decided to step in, right?
Well, I think that's one part of it, but you know, as your other guests touched on, I think a part of it is financial literacy. So you take young people in general who tend not to be very financially sophisticated, but then in China, coming from a culture of not using debt usually, whereas in the U.S., you know, there's a very clear distinction between families that are upper middle income because they're very sophisticated about mortgages, car loans, and they teach their kids how to be savvy consumers of financial services. So I think that is an advantage the United States has. That being said, so education I think is very important. Regulation is important as well. Even things like disclosure. Because we look at
disclosure of information.
Disclosure of information of the credit terms.
Okay.
So for example, a lot of time, I mean, this is how banks make their money. So they say, oh, the interest rate is 0% for the first 30 days, but they don't tell you it's 25%, and there's no reminder. And if you're late, there's a late payment charge, and the rate goes up if you're late. So I think banks are very skilled at making money because that's what they do. So
how good are we doing in China in terms of information disclosure among financial institutions?
I think Flora might have a better sense in terms of being a consumer, but my impression compared to the United States, which is what I'm most familiar with, is that the United States has more detailed and I think a more systemic way of disclosing the true costs of financing.
And what is the case here in China? I was told that actually the credit information of many consumers are not, first of all, not complete and not well linked on a single platform. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think now non-disclosure is even a lighter crime, and actually the direct fraud, cheating, you know, partial disclosure.
But you should be punished for doing that.
Well, because we have too many other issues that involve all the punishment. So that is why I think now, you know, only engage in, say, criminal law won't really help the situation unless, you know, it becomes a big social issue. But I think the more decisive solution is really to build a credit system across the country, and plus also the different cities should be more interconnected because you know, those loan sharks, they also play the information asymmetry between different cities, between different systems. So and also the self-discipline is also very important to have sort of association in this area. So, you know, to involve lawyers and to involve consulting firms. I know that some of the P2P platforms, they do not really want to deliberately do that, but they are also need literacy in how to play with the government, how to play with the consumers and the borrowers.
Okay, better education and better regulation. We've been talking about the credit card debt and what is the economic and social consequences of this problem. We'll be back in a minute. Talking about credit card debt and household debt, it seems it has something to do with the generational shift here in China in terms of demographies. Because the young people, they're not savers anymore. They're consumers. They're borrowers. They borrow money to spend money on their lifestyle. Why Chinese young people are more willing to spend than their forefathers?
I think there are many reasons. One is since the reform and the opening up of China, the Chinese young generations are more optimistic about their future. That's why they're more willing to spend, because they think anyways they're going to find a job and pay off the debt. The second reason is also because of the high housing price. In Beijing, the average housing price is 55 1,000 RMB per square meter, whereas an average person can only make 99,000 RMB per month. So if
that
you
means
do
they
the
should
math,
save more to buy a house.
if you do the math, it takes an average person almost 50 years to afford a 100 square meter house.
So they give up the possibility of buying a house.
Yeah, some of them
so spend more on their daily life.
They have given up the possibility of affording a house, so why not spend?
Is this something happening because the Chinese young people want to spend more money on their everyday goods rather than buying a house?
That's true. It's really in conformity with the expectancy theory that if you cannot achieve it, why you don't really start with it, from the very beginning. But I think another reason is that they also feel that they have something to fall back on, which is
their parents.
Their parents, and because most of the
house
millennials,
is my parents' problem, but my life is my problem.
That's right, and also that most of the millennials are really the single-child policy product. So therefore, they have nowhere to even to deal with their siblings. They thought, well, my parents' house is on mine, so I just wanted to spend it. So that's quite a popular ideology among this generation.
But Andy, obviously, you approve of this attitude change because Chinese should spend more.
Well, I think it depends. So I think first this issue of, if you can't afford to buy a house, therefore you're going to spend more on current consumption, may not be the entire picture. Because I think, first of all, in a place like Beijing, as I'm sure some of our viewers know, that being able to provide an apartment or a flat is a prerequisite for a lot of couples to get married. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a very powerful driver, at least for single men looking to get married.
But they all fall back on their parents to pay for
Sure,
that
was the other point, that also that parents often contribute the down payment, so then the kids just need to make the monthly payment. So it's a partial explanation, I think, but maybe not the entire explanation. But if we look at it from a macroeconomic perspective, I think that this greater use of consumer credit is a positive for the economy.
Positive thing.
Yes, because when we look at the goal of China's government, it's to shift the economy towards a more consumption-based, innovation-based economy. And consumer credit is the fuel that drives increased consumption. Okay. But you also have to manage it as well.
Let me pin you down on this. In January, already the household debt covers about a third of the whole debt number in China. Obviously, the GDP to GDP ratio is not that big, is around 50%. In advanced economies, it's probably 70 to 80%. But what worrying people is that it is catching up so fast. The household debt to GDP ratio is increasing fast. Should we worry about that?
I think from a long-term secular basis, I wouldn't say that there's definite cause for concern. But the whole issue of any type of financial market, any type of financial products, is they overshoot one way or another. And then in the short term, people get too excited, they get greedy. So there's too much, and there's a bubble, and then people get too scared, and then there's a correction. So, as long as the growth on an average basis over the long term is increasing, in the short term, we always will have these fluctuations. And, this is, of course, why we have people that trade short term, whether it's stocks or bonds or options, to make money. And that actually serves an important market function.
But the mismatch is that the increase in debt is not in line with the increase of income. The income is growing much slower than the debt.
That's right. Yeah. I think one is really the ecological changes, because China is known to the world to be a nation with big savings. We used to have more than 50% of the savings rate, even though people do not really want have a very luxurious life, and they still save a lot more. But now we see a substantial change even among our generation, that they realize that, well, why should I, save that much? And plus, also that people's normally by theory that people spend more on two reasons. One is that they have a better prospect of earning more. The other is the prospect of inflation. So when money is not really worth that much, if I just keep it in the bank or put it on a mattress, then I would really spend today.
Because what happened in 2008, the financial crisis in the U.S., is basically American people living beyond their means. It seems that the Chinese are on the same trajectory because we are too optimistic about
But
the
I think
future.
another one important reason which is different to what is going on in the West is that actually many households still are there to borrow money or to withdraw money simply to invest on the housing. So actually the savings rate is getting low, or even the loaning is getting higher, but actually they have more, at least more assets, more real estate.
But isn't that the risky thing? Because if the real estate market fluctuates, that means a lot of financial problems could come up.
We trust our government.
Well, that's a great point, but I guess what I wanted to add on that is that I think it's fundamentally different in China, because what caused the financial crisis in the United States was really lax underwriting standards, meaning that first the banks were lending against people buying houses, and then they wanted them to buy second homes, and then they had these so-called liar loans. So the essence of good lending is that you make sure that the person or the company you're lending money to can repay you.
Yeah.
But the way the market was structured, this is probably a little bit too technical, but the banks could sell the loans to someone else, so they had no incentive to make good underwriting decisions. The second
And you think this won't happen in China because it's different kind of loan?
Well, I think why it's less likely to happen is that also these banks were acting as independent economic actors, whereas in China, as we all know, even though it's the market plays a vital role, but it's still government-led, so that the banks are still, in a sense, agents of the government. So the government says, look, to keep the economy growing and to avoid a financial crisis, you need to keep lending.
Okay. I want to look at the culture side, Flora. You think the Chinese culture is still behind every people's behavior? Because culturally, the Chinese is still a saving culture. We like to save money. We are more cautious than the Westerners. Will that be a factor?
I think
we will not live beyond our means dramatically.
Yeah, that's a factor, definitely. Like, I am more reserved than my peers because both of my parents are very traditional, and they taught me the value of frugality.
Yeah.
And that's why I was able to pay off my debt very soon. And now I don't live on credit cards. I'd rather live on my WeChat Pay or Alipay. I would never use credit card. Yeah, that's definitely a factor, but at the same time, we can see that affected by the Western cultures, Chinese young generations are pursuing luxury goods more than ever before. Girls my age are using apps like Xiaohongshu, and whose logo is world's best lifestyle at finger point. So girls are encouraged to spend, and show off their luxury goods on social media, and that is affecting the Chinese traditional culture of frugality.
Yeah, mindset is evolving and economy is changing. We have to keep a close watch then. Thank you very much, Andy, Flora, and thank you, Mr.
Thank
Liu.
you so much.
And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.